Would you like to play some football?
Hey, welcome to another edition of Gridiron and the Gospel of Faith in College Football podcast. I'm George Schroeder.
And I'm Brad Edwards. And George, to set up this week, I need only quote former coach Dennis Green saying, "They are who we thought they were."
Oh, man.
And that's where we start with recapping this weekend's action.
And, of course, you're referring to the Nittany Lions of Penn State.
Absolutely.
Who had a big game. Now, it was a noon game, but they had a whiteout, and they acted like they liked the noon game, big noon Saturday. A whiteout against Ohio State, and another wipeout against Ohio State. I don't know if that's fair or not, but Ohio State 20, Penn State 13. When they play, Ohio State wins, and they are who we thought we are. They are, or we are, however you want to do it.
Yeah, and look, Penn State, we had questions about them coming in. They had not exactly been dominant week in and week out. They had the 7-point win over Bowling Green, earlier in the season. They had there's one other game I'm trying to remember what it was that was the USC. And look, USC seems to be a much better team at home than on the road. They're obviously not very good on the road. Is this something we should hold against Penn State? Obviously, USC has talent, but record, come back to the record. I guess that's a Bill Belichick. I quoted Dennis Green and now on to Belichick, which is what you are, what your record says you are. That's what USC is, and Penn State needed overtime to beat them. So, they get up to a quick 10-0 lead, and you're thinking, oh, maybe this is different. I didn't feel like they were physically overmatched as I have in some of the previous meetings. But when it came down to it, they couldn't get the ball in the end zone. The only touchdown they scored in the game was the interception return early. They had a couple of times they were inside the 5, and one was a turnover in the end zone. The other was a turnover on downs toward the end of the game. And we could certainly question the play calling in that series once they got goal to go with the chance to tie the game late. They didn't get it. Buckeyes, just outmanned them over the final 5 minutes, just ran and ran and ran. First down, and chewed up the clock, and Penn State never got the ball back. And that was pretty much it. It ended with a whimper.
Yeah, well, and here's the deal. James Franklin now 1-10 against Ohio State. 11 years, he's got one win against a top 5 opponent, which typically means Ohio State, right? It's typically who the top 5 opponent is. And the question is, would you be satisfied with that if you're a Penn State fan? And I think the answer is, and neither of us is a Penn State fan, but the answer is, nope, because we think we should be Ohio State.
Yeah, we're at least close to that, right? I mean, when you have a history like Penn State does, you've won a couple of national championships. You feel like, hey, that's who we are. That's what we're capable of being. And look, when James Franklin first got there, they were still reeling from the scholarship losses, the NCAA sanctions, and he was ahead of schedule when they did get that one top 5 win over Ohio State 2016. Ended up winning the Big Ten title. That was great. The fans couldn't have been happier at that point. But since then, they are now 0-11 against top 5 teams. And look, you're not expecting to win them all. Even Ohio State has a losing record under Ryan Day against top 5 teams. But you need to win one every now and then if you're going to be a championship team. And here's the bigger thing for me, I think, if I'm a Penn State fan, is that if you're ever going to be taken seriously as a national championship contender, not capable of making the playoff, which I think Penn State's going to do anyway this season.
Right.
But if you're going to be taken seriously as a team that actually has a chance to win the whole thing, you have to be capable of beating not one top 5 team, but probably more than one in back-to-back games, right? Like that's more than likely that's what it's going to take, or at least in the final 3 games, it's probably going to have to happen twice. And, when you can't beat one in 8 years, then you're probably not a national championship contender. And that means that Penn State really, if we're looking at it, George, they have not improved that much since year 3 under James Franklin. Now, look, have they? Yeah, I think you could point to a lot of things tangibly and say, this is better than it was. This is better than it was. But, once again, you are what your record says you are. And Penn State's been pretty consistently in recent years a top 10 team, but one that's not good enough to beat top 5 teams.
Well, listen, there's, as it relates to this team, it certainly appears they aren't weren't good. They weren't good enough Saturday at home with everything going your way. This isn't like you were at the Shoe in Columbus. You were at home, and they weren't good enough then. Doesn't say they won't be good enough now. Come December, here's what it probably means. It probably means, not necessarily, but probably means they will not have a bye, but they'll host a first round playoff game, quite possibly, which maybe gets them into the semis or something like that. Yeah, look, Penn State is who we thought they were. I still have lingering questions about Ohio State. Talk briefly about the other side of that matchup, but they did what they had to do, and quite frankly, they were the team that was in kind of the more. If there's such a thing as a desperate situation, and nothing's desperate yet, because I think we're going to have some 2-loss teams getting into the playoff. It's pretty clear, right? But the team with less margin for error was Ohio State. They'd already had the loss at Oregon in Eugene when they ran out of time, and played pretty well in Eugene, and he went toe to toe with Oregon, but didn't win. They needed to win it. They did. They did win it. And Ohio State looks like a team that's capable on certain days of playing with the top teams in the country, being a top team in the country, which is what we thought they would be. My lingering question about them remains, is Will Howard good enough to get it done at the highest level? Quarterback's never been more important. Now, look around. Oregon's quarterback Dylan Gabriel's of the top teams, they've got the best quarterback, at least in terms of, I'm not talking about pro potential or anything else. I'm talking about in terms of winning this season in college. Carson Beck hasn't lived up to his billing. Milroe hasn't lived up to what people thought he would advance to. We could go on, but my lingering question is Will Howard. He is a credible quarterback. He's a good quarterback. He doesn't have to be, CJ Stroud, but he's got to have to make some plays. And so that would be my lingering question about them. Very talented Buckeyes bunch. And it's a big, big, big win for them. And it puts them right back in the thick of things with Oregon. And one other team I know you want to talk about here in a second. I want to say one thing, though. All the Oregon is doing what a number one team is supposed to do. And it's weird for us to think of Oregon in that vein, probably as atop the polls. We were used to maybe seeing them in the top 5 over the last 10, 15 years, but atop the polls. But they went into Michigan, not a very good Michigan team, and just manhandled them. Did what you're supposed to do if you're a number one team against a team that, is okay. Michigan's your basic 7-5 unit is what they look like to me. They don't look anything like last year's national title team. But Oregon just went in and did what you're supposed to do. There was no trap involved, no nothing. They look really good. I wanted to throw that out there because I know we're not going to spend a lot of time on Oregon today, but the Ducks look really good. They look like the number one team in the country.
They do, and since the early struggles, the first 2 weeks didn't look like a top 10 team the first 2 weeks, but they have settled in, and since then, I think they're clearly playing the best of anybody in the country right now. And you're right, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Really, both sides of the ball are getting it done. And this week, they are a unanimous number one in the AP poll, which, given how much we've talked about the seeming level of parity that there is in college football this season, to have a unanimous number one at this stage of the season is surprising. But at the same time, I can't say that it's undeserved, because if I had a ballot, that's who I would have at number one.
Well, what do we have now? Among the major conferences, we got 3 unbeatens.
Well, so what do we have? We have Oregon, Indiana, and Miami. Yeah.
Right. And then Army is unbeaten, but, out of the American. But so I think, and am I missing someone in the group of 5? I don't think so.
BYU. Okay.
BYU. Yeah. That's out of one of the major conferences. So that's the biggest reason, is we're still bound to the wins and losses, but Oregon looks the part too. It's not like you can, you name me the one-loss team that you would say, oh, I think they ought to get a first-place vote. That team's not out there, just given the way the losses have come and how they've been up and down. You might have said a few people would vote for Georgia, but they struggled again. And if Florida doesn't have a quarterback injury yesterday, I'm not certain that Georgia overcomes Florida in the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. So, Georgia's up and down. Oregon makes sense at number one.
No, one of the things that we talked about last week when Jonathan was here,
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan,
pinch
for
hitting for
filling
you.
in.
Yeah, we talked about how now in college football, in order to win the national championship, you have to be good enough to win 3 consecutive games against top 10 caliber teams. And it's like, who actually looks like they're playing at that level? And that's the thing with Georgia, is that while we've seen how good they can be when they bring their A game against Texas or the second half against Alabama, there have been so many other instances through the season where they haven't really looked like a team. I mean, not at all looked like a team that's capable of winning 3 straight games against the highest level of competition. So that doesn't mean they can't do it. I mean, they've obviously, well, Kirby's been there. I'm not sure how many of the players on this roster have been there, but Kirby has been there. And I wouldn't be shocked if all of a sudden they flip the switch. But up to this point, we haven't seen that consistency. And going back to Oregon, that's what's been so impressive about them in recent weeks, is that they just, whoever the opponent is, they do to them what you should do to an opponent of that caliber if you are the best team in the country. And so, they are the number 1 team, and I assume that they will be by the selection committee. We haven't mentioned that yet, but by the time some people hear this podcast, we may already have those first rankings, but most of you will probably be listening to it just before the committee's first rankings come out on Tuesday night of this week. And those will be interesting, but I don't think that they're going to differ a whole lot in the top 5. Maybe once you get further down, differ from the AP poll. But
Well, I know you've got 3 or 4 games that we just want to touch on here.
Yeah.
But let's jump ahead for just 1 second, because this has to do with kind of what the committee. I'm intrigued by what the committee might do with the other team that you really wanted to talk about when we had our extensive pre-show production meeting earlier. Spend the entire afternoon before we record on Sunday night. That's not true, guys. I don't know if you can tell that we don't spend the entire afternoon, but Indiana 47, Michigan State 10. Indiana is 9-0 and has not trailed.
No, they
Army,
no.
Wait,
Army hasn't trailed. Indiana has.
Army has trailed now.
When did Army trail?
I think they trailed 3-0 to Air Force or something like that.
Oh, I think they were up
Okay,
3.
I don't know. Whatever.
So
but
anyway,
Indiana's looked really good.
Indiana's looked great. But here, this is why I was so impressed with Indiana. So last week, Jonathan
because they're
and I
9-0. That's like as many wins as they have in 3 or 4 seasons.
Oh, it's very, very un-Indiana, right?
Yeah.
To be 9-0 in football. But last week we talked about how, okay, they're 8-0 for the first time since 1960 something, and they're finally getting attention. And now is that moment where we've seen so many teams in college football over, I mean, the time that you and I have been covering it, last 30 years or so, teams that are not used to being in that position, you so often see them clam up. The pressure gets to them. And going on the road in conference play, I said, look, this is one of those weeks we're going to learn about Indiana. Not that they're playing a great team, but it's an easy position to lay an egg. They went down 10-0 to Michigan State on the road, and I kind of thought to myself, Indiana rolls off 47 unanswered points, wins 4.
You're right. So Army still hasn't trailed. Indiana now has.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but the fact that they got to, through 8 games without trailing, and then when they finally did trail, they fall down 2 scores on the road, and it doesn't even faze them. Their starting quarterback, Curtis Rourke, who didn't play the previous week, came back. And Indiana is another team like Oregon that is doing it on both sides of the ball. And I think people see the point totals they put up, and they're like, man, they got a good offense. Look at the points they're allowing. I mean, look, I realize they have not played a really good team yet. But, I mean, not only would I say it's Indiana, I mean, they're 9-0, but that's not easy to do week in and week out, just to maintain that consistency. And as we said before, doing what you should do against that quality of an opponent, and they really have done it. And you look at their remaining schedule, 3 games left. They have this coming Saturday, they're hosting Michigan. You just mentioned it. Michigan's not very good. Indiana absolutely should win this game easily. If you ignore the helmets, right? Ignore what happened last year. Yep. Indiana should win this game easily. The last game is against Purdue, and it's in Bloomington. That they should be a 4-touchdown favorite in that game.
Here's my question for you. All right. So you mentioned this. We record this Sunday night almost every week. That's the goal, is to record it Sunday night. So we've seen all the games of the weekend. You guys listen to it Monday or sometime throughout the week. And so it's possible you've already seen the selection committee rankings, but election day is the first ranking selection day. How is the committee going to treat Indiana, Brad? That's a question because, that's not that, fans think that the selection committee goes by helmets and they don't. But how are they going to treat the Hoosiers? Because that's not one of the helmets you typically see in these rankings.
Right. Yeah. So they're 8 in the AP poll, and I think when you start looking at those teams, George, I don't think they're going to be any further down than that with the selection committee because
Would
of
they
what
be
we just
higher
said.
than that?
Yeah, I think they could be. So let's look at for example, Tennessee. Tennessee's one space ahead of Indiana in the AP poll. Tennessee has a loss. Indiana doesn't. Now Tennessee does have a win over Alabama, which is far better than any team that Indiana's beaten. Tennessee has really struggled offensively, especially in the first halves of for basically a month now, like 4 straight games. I think they have a combined 7 first half points, and they're not clicking. It's obvious that Tennessee is not coming close to playing up to its potential, and yet Indiana is undefeated. Or you're right, or maybe that is who they are.
I mean, that's the thing. We may be at about 3 teams that could win the whole thing. Well, we may be getting to that point, that discussion later. Well, and then a bunch of teams with a lot of flaws.
Yeah, so staying in the conference, I mean, I'm looking one spot ahead of Tennessee in the AP poll. Penn State. Should Penn State be ranked ahead of Indiana?
Okay, now granted, starts with having been ranked whatever they were, 3rd last week.
But Penn State, as we mentioned, had the close call with Bowling Green. I mean, they didn't almost lose, but they only won by 7. The overtime win over USC. Indiana's closest game, I believe, is 14 points.
This is what will be fascinating about Tuesday night is this. The thing about the AP poll and the coaches poll is when you get into after week 10, right? After week 10, I think. I guess I should know that. It's week 9 or 10. It's week 10 because we've got some teams with byes and nobody's got more than 9 wins. But when you get to week 10, they have been ranked, these guys in the AP and the coaches polls have been ranking people over and over again. And so what the selection committee is going to do is come in fresh and rank them through 10 weeks of the season. And it'll be fascinating to see if theirs look different because they weren't slid into earlier rankings each week. That'll be fascinating to see. I love what the selection committee does. I love how they do it. I love how they go about what they do. And we're going to have lots of arguments and everything else about it, I'm sure, down the stretch. It's just how that works. And I don't mean you and me. I mean the college football conversation.
Yeah, and look, what you're saying, though, George, is important because, where some of these teams are. So we look at Indiana, and as many great things as there are to say about them right now, we expect that they are going to lose one of their final 3 games. They might not. I mean, Ohio State's not unbeatable, or I should say they are beatable, however you want to look at it. Nebraska.
Well, they've been beaten.
They've been beaten, and Nebraska took them to the wire in Columbus, which is where Indiana plays them. But let's just say Ohio State wins that game. If Indiana comes in, let's say the committee ranks them 10, and then they lose one of their final 3 games, now all of a sudden you're majorly on that bubble as to whether you're going to get in. If you're up at 6 and then you lose a close game on the road to the committee's, let's just say, number 2 team or whatever they may be, now it's something that I don't think you really have to worry about that much if you're Indiana. Now, of course, at this point, they're trying to win a Big Ten championship. They're not thinking about, getting into the 12-team playoff. But I think for a lot of teams, when these first rankings come out, that's what you're looking at. Teams that you're projecting still have a loss remaining on the schedule. If they're barely inside that 12 now, then maybe they can't afford that loss. And I think that's going to be the fun thing to see. And so kind of along those lines, there were some games this weekend that I would say pretty much any other time, certainly in the BCS era. At this stage of the season, we would have
14 playoff era too, pretty much.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. In the BCS and 14 playoff era. So basically over the last 20 plus years, 5 years, we games like this first weekend in November, we might have said, yeah, that was a fun game,
Separation Saturday or whatever, right?
But we wouldn't have considered most of these games to have any real stakes because the teams were too far back to really be considered a national title contender in the old format. And these are the games I'm talking about. There were 5 teams ranked between 10 and 18 that lost over the weekend, starting with number 10 Texas A&M all the way down to number 18 Pitt. But that included Iowa State and Clemson, which were both at number 11 in the AP poll, tied last week, and then Kansas State at number 17. So when all those teams go down, that's kind of what we would look at as the bubble range, in the rankings each week, assuming that, that the committee rankings are similar to AP. But regardless of what the committee has, that range, like every time there are losses in kind of the back end of the top 12 or let's say anywhere in that 10 through 15 range, those are significant. And we had a few of them. And so, Texas A&M was the lone team that went into the weekend still undefeated in SEC play. They took their first conference loss, but second overall loss. And now they're probably in a must-win out situation, which means they have to beat Texas at the end of the season, including a couple of other games to stay alive. And you look at some of these other teams, George, and this is where I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Back at the beginning of the season, we were discussing on the podcast how much more fun it was going to be when these first committee rankings came out, because unlike the 4-team model, where you might have looked down to maybe as far as 15 and said, okay, these teams still all are, or most of them are technically in it. We kind of, I think we kind of agreed that pretty much the whole top 25, those teams are still going to be in play by the time those first rankings come out. But I'm looking at it now, and if you got a chance, pull up the AP top 25. Yep. And I'm looking at these and I'm asking myself, how many teams in the top 25 are not really still in this thing as far as a chance to make the 12-team playoff? I see a few. Now, there's some that I feel like even if they win out, they're not going to be in. There are a couple of others that's like, okay, if they won out, they might be able to get in, but they're not going to win out. Like they've got a game left that it would be a shocking upset if they were to win it. What's your thought as you look at that? Like,
as we sit here today, understanding they've got to play and you've got to win or lose, and some of them we expect to lose, right? Some of them are going to play each other and lose. But as we sit here today, I think 22 might still be in it. And the only reason I say that is I'm going to disregard Vanderbilt at number 24. They've got 3 losses, and the only possible way they could make it is by winning the SEC, which they're not going to get in. They can't get into the conference title game. It'd be really hard to get there.
There would have to be an avalanche of chaos.
And Louisville doesn't have a path at 6-3, quite likely. They got a shot, but it's going to be hard for them to get in to the ACC title game too. The other one would be Washington State, even though they're 7-1. I find it hard to believe they're going to make it as an at-large, which is kind of what they'd have to do, because of the dissolution of the Pac-12, at least for now. And the fact that they can't really constitute one of the top, 5 conferences. So those would be the 3. I know we could probably quibble about a couple and say, well, what about this one? What about that one? But everybody else, pretty much, I could see a path at least into their conference title game. And if you get into your conference title game, you got a shot. Some of them I can see finding their way into one of those 7 at-large berths.
Yeah, and so that's where, so you're right, George, because the conference champion of, let's say, the Big 12 conference champion will be in. So if BYU has to play someone in that game, and whether it's Iowa State or Kansas State, Colorado,
right?
If any of those teams, probably one of them is going to be the opponent, and if that team beats BYU, they're in. So it wouldn't require a major upset. But it is difficult to kind of sit there and look at it right now and take these teams seriously as far as being a threat to get up there into that top 12 range, right?
Well, that's where.
But they don't have
results.
Yeah.
Of last week, you mentioned of Saturday, right? Texas Tech upsets Iowa State, which was unbeaten at the time. And then Houston beats K-State. And when that happens, what it really did was it probably shrunk the Big 12 down from a potential 2-bid league down to a 1-bid league again, which is what we would have thought going in, but as the season had played out. So it probably did that. And it may not have, but it probably did.
By the same token, I think that the ACC with Clemson's loss went from being a potential 3-team playoff league to now more than likely a 2-team league. I mean, Clemson, having been blown out out of conference by Georgia and now needing some help. Now look, is it far-fetched that Clemson could get some help and get into the ACC title game? It's not incredibly far-fetched. And if it happens, it's the same thing we just have with the Big 12. They just have to win the game and then they're in as the ACC champion. But barring that help, like I can't see Clemson, getting up into the top 12. So
this is why, by the way, they went to the 12 team. This is one of the many reasons they went to the 12-team playoff, is because we'd be making our cut line right now today in the 4-team era at, I don't know, well, I could see 11 or 12 teams could find their way in, and boy, it's a stretch to really get them in there. Right now, we probably could have put the entire top 25 in there somehow. There's scenarios for even those 3 lost teams at the bottom, Vanderbilt and Louisville. They're not getting in, but there's scenarios where you can, and so that's the conversation they wanted to have it deeper into November. And they're going to have it deep into November for most of these teams.
Even Army sitting there, look, it's easy to dismiss Army because of who they've played, but they do have Notre Dame left on the schedule, and I believe the game is in South Bend. If Army were to beat them.
Ask Navy how that went recently.
Well, no, I know. I'm not expecting the game to even be close. And the reason I say that is because Notre Dame's so good on the defensive front, which is the most important thing to stopping the type of offense that they run.
Mm-hmm.
But if they were to beat them, if they're undefeated with a win over Notre Dame, I'm kind of leaning toward they got a shot to get it. Well, so here's where it would get tricky, though, George, because as you know, like they would be in theory, the American Athletic Conference champion, but I don't think they would be the highest ranked of the non-Power 4. The question becomes, like, would there be a chance if there was an upset in the Big 12 championship game that they could actually be ranked higher than the Big 12 champion? That I hope we have that conversation later. It's not anything to get bogged down on right now, but yeah, there are some possibilities out there that'll be fun to discuss. And of course, the other thing is over the next probably 2 weeks, several of these will blow up. But at least right now, it's fun to sit there and look at it. So, hey, one other thing related to the playoff I just wanted to mention before we move on. I was looking at, once again, the AP poll today, and I was kind of doing in my head, if the season ended today and those were the committee rankings, what the seeding would be. And I just wanted to point out something that just to help people understand how weird this is going to feel because of the requirement that the top 4 seeds have to be conference champions. And so therefore, you're going to end up with situations where quite often the number 5 team is going to be better than the number 4 team. And in some cases, number 5 will probably be better than number 3 as well, as far as the seedings for the playoff. So if we were to start this thing today, the number 1 seed would be Oregon, number 2 would be Georgia, 3 would be Miami, and 4 would be BYU. 5 would be Ohio State. Okay. Now I'm going to skip on down because what I want to tell you is that based on, and look, and I'm picking one set of power rankings, and you can think whatever you want of these power rankings, but the ESPN FPI, of the teams that are ranked in the top 12 of the AP poll right now, there are only 2 of them. There are only 2 of them that are not ranked in the top 15 of FPI. One of those is Boise State, which I think is 19th. The other one is BYU, which is like 28th. Okay. Ohio State, as the number 5 seed, would get to play both of them in theory. Ohio State as the 5 would play in the first round, would host Boise State. And then if they win that game, then they would get to play number 4 BYU. So I'm not saying it's going to end up like this, but I just want you to see there's already a scenario you can look at where the number 5 seed actually gets the best draw of anyone, at least as far as the best draw to get to the semis. And then, of course, at that point, you probably end up playing number 1, which is not once you get to that stage, I don't know that it really matters a whole lot whether you're playing number 1 or number 2. They're all great teams, but I just thought that was interesting to look at it. We know that in many years, number 5 is going to play that smaller conference or, mid-major, whatever we want to call it, representative at number 12 with the number 12 seed. That's going to be common. But then they're also going to have times where they're going to be able to turn around and then play a number 4 seed that's not as good as them either. And so it is kind of weird, and it's going to take some getting used to because it is very different than the way it's seated for basketball.
That's right, for sure. Well, all right. So real quick, just I don't want to get deep into it, and we really don't have time to. But this was a light week on the docket this previous weekend, which is of course why we had these weird upsets that you weren't expecting. This week, though, we jump back into it. Georgia at Ole Miss, which suddenly looks more intriguing than you would have said it was because of Georgia's struggles with Florida, because Ole Miss got its offense, completely untracked in Fayetteville against Arkansas. Michigan and Indiana, which is interesting. You'd mentioned that earlier. Colorado at Texas Tech. It's probably time that we're going to have to start talking about Deion and the Buffs again.
That's why this game is interesting, because I think most people around the country
suddenly back in it because of all those upsets, the two upsets last week.
Most people have kind of lost track of Colorado and don't realize where they are in the conference standings. But this is a challenging game. But if they win it, you're right, George. Like, we have to start paying attention to Colorado as a team that has a chance to be in that Big 12 championship game, and therefore
they control their own destiny because of those losses to Iowa State and Kansas State. Not their losses, but the losses Iowa State and Kansas State took this weekend. So, Colorado at Texas Tech, it's time to start looking, and Deion and the Buffs don't look now. Who knows?
That's right.
They're already bowl eligible, which is an accomplishment in year two, but they might as well be looking for more, and I'm sure they are. The game that would be the be-all, end-all game in a lot of years is Alabama at LSU, Brad, and it's not the be-all, end-all game, but for both teams, it's essentially a must-win.
Yeah, this is like a survival game because they both have two losses, and we've discussed it for a few weeks now. This just does not appear to be a season where a 3-loss team is going to get into this playoff. So, and for LSU,
because we have such a wonderful track record of knowing what the committee does and it doesn't do with 12 teams.
But for LSU, they still only have one loss in the conference. So if they win this game, they're still alive to be able to get to Atlanta and win the SEC. Alabama would need some help, but when you look at Alabama's remaining schedule, not to say that they aren't capable of losing any of those games, but their last three are against Oklahoma, Mercer, and Auburn.
Yeah, I'm worried about Mercer.
You would think that if Alabama gets by LSU, they should finish 10-2 and end up in the playoff. Yeah, I mean this for Alabama, it almost feels like this is a win and you're in game just because of how much Oklahoma and Auburn have been struggling.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And by the way, Auburn losing at home to 17-7 to Vanderbilt. Just a quick shout out: Vanderbilt is bowl eligible. They're in the top 25 at 6-3, and they're bowl eligible. And that is an amazing accomplishment. And good for Clark Lee and Diego Avia and the guys in Nashville. Good for them. Jonathan Howe's churchmates, both of them, are excited. So BYU at Utah, also the Holy War, as they call it in the state of Utah. That's, it's lost some luster with Utah kind of falling off the map a little bit this year. But it is a big game, and it's definitely a potential sort of pitfall.
Yeah, and if you're looking at BYU, their remaining schedule, they have 2 road games left. This one, because of the rivalry, you would think is very dangerous. And then they're also at, I think it's Arizona State. So, as far as BYU's chance to go undefeated, and by the way, that's one of these questions, like if they go 12-0, even if they lose the Big 12 championship game, might they still get in? That's one of these things to look at. Yeah.
They'd be the one. That's the scenario now where the Big 12 gets 2 teams in, possibly, I think. So
if you're one of those teams outside of the Big 12 that's on the bubble, you want to see BYU take a loss before the conference championship game to kind of ensure that the Big 12 is a one-bid league. Yeah.
All right. Which one of those games, I just mentioned Georgia at Ole Miss, Michigan at Indiana. Which one of those games do you want to watch if you had to watch one? Georgia at Ole Miss, Michigan at Indiana, Colorado at Texas Tech, Alabama at LSU, and then BYU at Utah. Alabama at LSU is a Saturday night at Death Valley, Tiger Stadium. But which of those would you say I've got to watch?
Well, I mean, Alabama LSU is just, it feels like it's just destined to be close. It's almost like too easy to pick. But the one that's the most intriguing to me is Georgia at Ole Miss, just because I don't know which Georgia is going to show up. And like you said, based on what both teams look like this previous weekend, if Ole Miss wins that game, I mean, obviously they can win that game. And if they do, this changes a whole lot of the way that the SEC kind of sets up playoff wise, because now all of a sudden Ole Miss is very much back in it with a chance to finish 10-2. Georgia would take its second loss, still with Tennessee coming up. I don't know what that would do to the race as far as like who'd be most likely to end up in the conference championship game, but it probably wouldn't be Georgia anymore. So yeah, that there's a whole lot. I don't know. I just think there are more variables in play with Georgia Ole Miss than there are with Alabama LSU. Alabama LSU is pretty simple, which is the winner kind of survives, whereas the loser is more than likely done. If Georgia wins, it doesn't do a whole lot, but if Ole Miss wins, it really shakes things up.
Well, if Ole Miss wins, it puts the Rebels firmly back in the playoff chase, and you begin to wonder, is this even possible that we could say that Georgia might not make it into the playoff as an at-large team? That would only be their second loss, but still, you begin to wonder, and I think they'd still be in if they won out. But I'm just saying that would remove any of their margin for error too.
Yeah.
Which so that's a good one. But look, here's the thing: that's 5 games. You can basically put the multi-view on and start watching. And that's why we love college football. That's why we love Saturdays in the fall, right? So even though the time has changed, and I just have to, give my minor complaint, I would really love to have daylight savings for all time. So I want everyone to get behind Marco Rubio's proposal for that. I don't care where you come from politically. We can all get behind that, please.
I think I saw Tuberville had a video on that pushing it.
Yeah. So, obviously we got an extra hour of sleep last night, which was great. It helped me because I watched a night kickoff 60 miles away in Waco, Texas, and then still made it back and got a good night's sleep before the church services this morning. But
I'm happy for you,
now
George.
It's dark. Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
thank
but
you.
I did not. Here's the thing. If you have a dog, the dogs don't get the memo that the clock went back, so therefore sleep another hour. They still get up at the same time as they did the previous few days. And
our student pastor made the point that if you have small children, he said, you don't get an extra hour to sleep, you get an extra hour to get ready to come to church.
That's right.
So dogs and small children,
yeah.
I'm with you on that. But I can't wait for March in terms of, no, listen, I want college football to keep going, but I can't wait for March and whenever the time changes back. I just want you guys to know
I thought you were about to say the basketball tournament. I kind of forgot where you were going with this. I was like,
no, it's all daylight savings here. That's what I want. So let's talk about our picks.
Yeah.
I got a pick made for me, and then Jonathan tried to deep six me. So thank you, Jonathan, for having me pick Iowa State. And I'm kind of locked into Iowa State as a pick for the playoffs. I may lose this thing,
George,
because I was on a mission trip to Mexico, and Jonathan Howe picked Iowa State.
If you you're a man of honor, and so I will. If you tell me that there was another team you were going to pick, we can take Iowa State off, because I feel confident in this. You were not going to select Iowa State.
I feel confident in that too, but because I wasn't paying attention, I didn't have one pick, so I'm kind of stuck. So I'll just wear it and become a big Cyclone rooter right now.
I'm not going to feel right about winning this competition if you lose it because of Jonathan's pick.
Well, neither one of us is going to win it. It's going to be one of our listeners. So
Probably.
It's all good. But so the way this thing works, and if you're not competing with us, it's too late to compete, but you can just listen to our bad picks. But if you are competing with us, please send your your whatever pick it is. I'm reading from an old sheet. Send your pick to gridirongospelpod@gmail.com by Wednesday of this week. But Brad, tell everybody what we're doing.
Yeah, so we started 12 weeks out from the committee's final playoff pairings, and each week on the podcast we pick one team that we think at that time is a not a certainty, but a good pick to make the playoff. And so we have taken one each week. We're kind of building a roster of what we think will be the playoff field. And some weeks you feel pretty good about your picks, some weeks you don't. And so this is going to be the 8th team that we'll be adding to our eventually 12-team list. And mine so far are Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, Oregon, Penn State, Georgia, and last week I took Boise State. The only one in that group that I feel not so great about is Alabama, but I will feel a whole lot better if they win this Saturday. So
Right, and a whole lot worse if they lose,
And
but,
a whole lot where
whatever.
I'll feel like
Yeah.
that one's done if they lose.
Yeah,
But
well, unfortunately, I've already picked Alabama too, so if that were to happen and I'm not rooting for it, I would feel bad too. So it would
yeah,
be a push in terms of you
yeah.
and me.
So I'm going to add to my list here this week, Miami. And I got to tell you, I don't feel great about this, even though on one hand, at Miami's 9-0. And I feel like if they win the next 3 games or 12-0 going into the ACC championship game, they are in the playoff, win or lose, whether they're that conference title winner or not. But the last 3 games, I mean, just the way that Miami just seems to go week in and week out, not knowing how many points that defense is going to give up. I shouldn't be worried about at Georgia Tech and at Syracuse, but for some reason, I just don't trust this team. And so it's fun. Like I look at them ranked number 4 in the AP poll this week, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Now they are a great offensive team and a lot of fun to
They
watch.
remind me, and this somebody said this, and maybe it was one of you guys on the podcast last week when I listened to it and thought to myself, I hope I haven't been Wally pipped and replaced by Jonathan Howell. Thankfully, he's not here tonight, so I'm back in the lineup. But somebody mentioned this, and maybe I saw it on, I don't know, College Football Final or something, but Cam Ward may get them to the playoff. Now, it's easier to do now than it was when Kyler Murray got that Oklahoma team to the playoff, but it reminds them a little bit of that 2018 Oklahoma team. 2018, I think. Yeah, it was 2018 Oklahoma team when Kyler Murray won the Heisman, was really, really good and kind of willed Oklahoma with a great offense, but he was clearly the catalyst to the playoff, despite the worst defense we've seen in probably of a playoff participant in the playoff era. I don't know that Miami's defense is that bad.
They're
but
not that
similarity. There's a similarity there in terms of Cam Ward's abilities and what he's able to do when necessary. But it could trip you up in the season too. So
yeah. So anyway, I look at none of the last 3 teams should be able to hold Miami under 40. And so should the defense be good enough to not get them, outscored by one of those teams? Yes. So I'm going to just pick Miami here and hope that they do what they should do, which is handle what is a fairly easy remaining schedule.
Yep. Well, I picked Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State. Jonathan Howe picked Iowa State for me, and I'm going to keep it, right? That's fine. I don't feel great about Alabama. So there's a couple ways you could go. First of all, what about SMU? Well, can't do that yet, but we're about a week away from starting to talk about SMU for things. But BYU is on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not ready to go there. I need them to get through the Holy War, beat Utah first, and then we'll see. And it's getting tougher now, obviously, and that's part of the design of this competition. I'm going to have to go Miami as well, and I don't feel good about it. But
what about Indiana? Did you think about Indiana?
I did think about Indiana, but I'm not ready to go there. I mean, it's very possible they're going to get in because it's very possible they will have no more than 1 loss. Or, are they going to get in with 2 losses? Let's say they take a loss somewhere in the regular season and then they lose to Oregon in the title game or something like that in the Big 12 championship game. Are they going to get in? I don't think they are, but maybe they are because the Big 10 may get 3 or 4 teams in.
I don't think, unless something weird happens, I don't think they would get into the title game at 11-1 because the 1 loss would be to Ohio State.
So would they have a chance to get in? Maybe so at 11-1. I think they would. So probably I should take them. You know what? You talked me into it. This sounds crazy.
There you go.
I'm taking Indiana. I mean,
I'll say this. It's not crazier than Iowa State.
Well, no. I mean, I figured Jonathan already deep sixed my entire opportunity. I might as well go with Indiana. So I took Indiana, guys.
Okay. There you go.
So that's where we are.
I should have done that too, but I think we're both safe, but I'll probably end up taking Indiana next week. Yeah.
So. Well, that's it, man. We're going to have to wrap this up and get into the locker room and then come back to the second half and talk about our favorite subject, which is our shared faith in Jesus. So we'll be right back with more of Gridiron and the Gospel of Faith in College Football podcast.
Welcome back into Gridiron and the Gospel of Faith in College Football podcast. I'm Brad Edwards along with George Schroeder, and this is the second half where we talk about our shared faith in Jesus. And we started off with a segment that we call On My Heart. And George, you were out of the country last week. So you didn't get to participate in this. I guess it's the first time either one of us has kind of missed out on this segment, but you can make up for it this week by sharing with everyone what is on your heart. So go for it.
Yeah, and listen, I tried to pop into our recording session and couldn't pull it off with the Wi-Fi I had. We were just across the border in Mexico, and just didn't have the Wi-Fi I needed for the I guess the bandwidth.
Well, thanks for thinking of us.
Yeah, well, I thought it was only a brief thought, just so you know. But yeah, but listen, I could share some stories from the brief little mission trip we were on, but we've been working through the little letter of First Peter in our church these last month and a half, whatever, and still got a ways to go. But in First Peter 2, Peter starts to talk about a subject that we don't like, and he's writing to followers of Christ who he describes as exiles spiritually, even though they're still living in the same place they grew up. You know, that everybody's their countrymen and everything else. These are not Jewish people; they're Gentiles in the region we would now know as northern part of Turkey. They've come to Christ, and they're now exiles. They're exiled kind of from the culture. They're exiled from polite society, but they're citizens of another country. They're citizens of heaven, right? And so he tells them that they have a living hope, and that's Jesus. They have a reward, an inheritance waiting for them in heaven, and keep your eyes on that, on sort of on the prize. And he starts to tell them how to relate to other people. Abstain from these types of things. Desire the pure milk of the word. We talked about all that. Desire Jesus. We talked about that the last time I did this. And then he says, and this is where it gets tough. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. Submit. I don't really have to say much else, right? Submit.
Right. That's hard.
Yeah. Nobody wants, that's a word where like immediately we recoil. Submit to every human authority. Or other translations would say every human institution. Submit to every human authority. Why? Because of the Lord, or for the Lord's sake. Whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors as those sent out by him to punish those who do what is evil, and to praise those who do what is good. For it's God's will that you silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. Submit as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but as God's slaves. Verse 17, honor everyone. Love the brothers and sisters, meaning fellow Christ followers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And it's kind of interesting that we're here, and this week we talked about the first college football playoff rankings, but you mentioned it's also election day. So by the time many of you guys listen to this, you will have voted. The vote counts will, we hope, be in.
Hopefully, yes.
We'll know somebody has won various elections, but obviously the one we're mostly tuned to probably is the presidential election. And I would just encourage you, if you are a Christ follower, you ought to read 1 Peter chapter 2 this week. Because whether your preferred candidate wins or not, you're called to submit to every human authority. Now, listen, if they tell you to do something that is contrary to God's word, we are not to do that. But in general, we're called to a posture of civil obedience. This is not unique to me. This is not a word. This is not a term I brought up. I came up with. I think I heard that from a pastor, H.B. Charles. But civil obedience, and we think of civil disobedience, which is appropriate at times. In general, we're called to be civilly obedient, to be model citizens, and to submit to every human institution. It's interesting that Peter talks about the emperor, because the emperor at that time, in the latter half of the first century, the Roman emperor was Nero. And he either was about to embark, he was a very, very evil guy. I mean, terribly evil, bad guy. He was about to either embark on or already had embarked on a campaign to persecute Christians specifically. But he was a bad guy. And Peter, they knew who this guy was. And Peter says, honor the emperor, submit to the emperor. So we got presidents. And we've got all sorts of freedoms that others didn't have. And as Christ followers, we have freedoms that Christians especially didn't have in the Roman Empire. And we are called to follow these words too. We're called to submit to every human authority. Why? Because of the Lord, for his sake. For the Lord's sake. Submit. And we're called to honor everyone and honor the emperor, honor the president, regardless of which candidate wins and whether you're happy about it. Honor them. I mean, I can think of a million reasons why, but why do we honor everyone, including the people who don't look like you, act like you, vote like you? Because they're made in God's image and because they probably need to know Christ. And if we're so fired up politically that first of all, it's not our ultimate purpose to live here for politics, but if we're so fired up politically about things that we see them in any way other than, man, I hope that person comes to know Christ, that's tough. So honor everyone, even the people that disagree with you, even the people that mistreat you. If we kept moving through 1 Peter, and we have in our church, you'd see that even if you're mistreated, especially if you're doing right and you're mistreated, you honor everyone. And it says in verse 21, for you were called to this, basically to suffer, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And then it talks about what his steps actually were. He didn't commit sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. And when he was insulted, he did not insult in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And it goes on to say, Peter just basically preaches the gospel. Jesus himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that having died to sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but you have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So, Christian, Christ follower, we're called to this. We're called to suffering if need be, but we're called to honor everyone. We're called to be like Jesus, to follow in his steps, and his steps are the way of the cross. So I would encourage you to do that. If you don't know Christ, what I just described is what he's done. He's paid the penalty for sin, and if you'll call on him, he'll save you. And Brad and I would love to talk to you about that. I wish you'd reach out to us. We would love to talk to you about that, pray with you about that, pray for you about that. That's what's on my heart, Brad.
Well, thanks, George. I love the perspective on the historical context that First Peter was written in. And when you say that it was probably in the time that Nero was the emperor of Rome,
It was
Yeah.
it was during that time.
I mean, so when you look at it that way, I mean, we're obviously aware of the panic on both sides with this election and this thought that if the other side wins, it's going to be the end of democracy and
Right.
whatever
Flight
you want to
93
call it.
election or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. However you want to define it, it will be nothing like what it was to be a Christian in the Roman Empire under Nero. And so if Peter says that's the way that we're to submit to authority, then I think it's more than relevant for the situation that we're in. And, just remembering that whatever happens, whoever wins, whether it's your team or the other team, that God is still on the throne, right?
He's got this. Yeah.
The Son is seated at the right hand of the Father, and we have work to do, no matter who is in the White House, right? Like we still have work to do as Christians, and that doesn't change. And that's, I think that's what we need to focus on. And look, not that we won't be distracted by what happens on Tuesday. And like you said, might end up taking the rest of the week to iron out, or maybe longer, hopefully not.
Oh my goodness. Let's hope
not.
But
at a certain point, we have to refocus on what we're here for. And it's not to cheer on a political candidate.
Yeah. I saw, what did I see? Where did I see this? This is a tweet that somebody sent me. I can't believe in only 3 days, everyone will have to instantly go from being a polling expert to an election law expert. So, and obviously it's a joke, but that's kind of how wrapped up we can get in politics. And y'all, let me just say this. If you're a Christ follower, God's got you and God's got this. Whatever happens, he's got it. He's in control. And Brad, I'm so glad you said that. He's in control. And our role is to submit, unless we're told to do something contrary to God's word, joyfully and to honor everyone as we do it. Our conduct should be, regardless of who wins, our conduct should be such that people see Christ in us.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, George, because we talked about this, back, I don't know, it's probably like 2 months ago.
Yeah,
And with some of the rhetoric, involved in the campaigning and all that, and that is a great reminder that if your side wins and you're out there taunting people, or your side loses and you're using certain language and insults and whatever accusations you might want to throw around, if you are identified publicly as a follower of Jesus, just keep that in mind as far as what comes out of your mouth, what you post online, because it is all a reflection of much more than just yourself.
that's right. Well, that's what's on my heart. And y'all, we should pray for our nation, right? If you're hearing this
Absolutely.
and it's before the election, pray for it. If it's after the election, pray for our nation. But no, God's got this. Pray for the leaders. Pray for the candidates. Pray for the winner, and honor them as you do that. We're told elsewhere that we're to pray for our leaders, and that means, our leaders, whether you vote for them or not. So, but pray for them, and know God's got this, and know that we want to talk with you. All right, we want to talk with you if you have questions about this faith in Christ that Brad and I have. He saved us, and he has given us life, and it is why we live. It's most definitely why we do this podcast. As much as we love college football, this is why we do this podcast, because we want to share our faith in Christ with you. We hope you can see and hear Christ in us, and we hope to get to talk with you about that at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want to reach out to us, you can always email us at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. He is
I
at
can't
George
get there.
Schroeder,
Yeah.
and I am at J. Brad Edwards.
Yeah, or at gridiron_gospel. That's also our Twitter handle for the pod itself. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe in your favorite podcast app. We really appreciate that. That helps us. Tell your friends about us. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms. You just have to search for Gridiron and the Gospel, or you can follow the links at the show's website.
And if you are interested in partnering with us in any capacity, whether it be your church, a specific ministry, business that you have, just please reach out to us at the Gmail address that we gave just a little while ago, gridirongospelpod@gmail. We would love to explore that and have a discussion with you if that's something that interests you.
Yep. Tune in next week, y'all, for more Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast.